Welcome to Sardo TV. I'm Vaishali Jain. We'd like to welcome Dan Lovely to the studio today. Dan is the former Chief Learning Officer of AIG and the former Head of People Intelligence at BNY Mellon, and he's here to tell us about trends and challenges in organizational learning today. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to have you here.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure.
So you've had a long career in various aspects of learning and development, most recently as the former Chief Learning Officer of AIG, and before that as the Head of People Intelligence at BNY Mellon. Tell us about what you're doing today and how you got to where you are.
Sure. Well, my journey was, I think, the classic case of really lifelong learning. You know, I was lucky enough that I started my career at British Petroleum or BP, and BP had a strong focus on development. So even though I started as a geoscientist, I was able to move into finance, into operations, into risk and control, strategy and planning, and then finally I got into HR. Once in HR, I was able to focus on learning, talent management, diversity and inclusion, various other things. And also I moved on from BP, so I said I had a career in oil and gas, but also in insurance, in financial services, in health, and insurance. And so really for me, it really hasn't been a clear path of what my career trajectory has been, as much as constantly looking for new opportunities to learn and take advantage of those opportunities when they come. So currently I've just left AIG and I'm in discussions right now with Columbia University about potentially moving into a position in academics there.
So you didn't follow a particular career path to become Chief Learning Officer per se?
Not a path, but I did know that there are certain skills I needed to develop. So one, I really need to understand adult learning. How is it adults really learn? Two, I had to understand the proper utilization of learning technologies and get up to speed of how all that's advancing. Third is I had to understand how do we actually determine what learning needs really are, developmental needs. And finally, I had to become global. How do I actually operate on a global basis? So it wasn't a clear path as in what exact jobs to get, but I knew those are areas of skills which I had to develop.
Tell us more about your role as Chief Learning Officer at AIG.
At AIG, when I was the Chief Learning Officer there, I was really accountable for all the learning development across the entire organization of about 60,000 people. But I also had to build the learning function. When I first came in, there were 27 separate learning organizations. I brought that all together. So eventually we had a group of about 350 people, probably an annual budget of about $100 million. The other thing I had to do there was really modernize their approach to learning and development. When I first got there, it was very traditional, mainly face-to-face programs, some e-learning programs. We put in adaptive learning technologies. We put in different ways, different learning platforms, different modalities of learning to really increase the effectiveness of the learning.
And AIG was also going through a learning transformation.
That's right.
Is that part of what you were doing with these programs?
The learning transformation at AIG had two major components. One was to build this new learning function, again, to centralize and bring together all those components and standardize and improve the processes. The other one, which is more challenging, was to build a learning culture, to actually build a culture that truly valued learning and openly shared that information. We made fantastic progress on the building of the function. I think we only made partial progress really on building of the learning culture, and there's still a lot of work to be done for that to be completed.
What are some of the issues with building a learning culture that you were facing?
I think one of the challenges is that AIG in particular was what I would describe as a manic organization. It was really prone for action, but what it didn't allow time for was time for reflection. And I don't think you can be a learning organization unless you actually had that time for reflection. You know, we often talk about people learn from experience. It's actually not true. People learn by reflecting on experiences, and if you don't have that time for reflection, you really don't build in the learning. But more importantly at AIG, it just became distracted. We had activist investors and other challenges that actually took some of the energy of the focus on learning away, at least temporarily.
How did all of this impact employees?
To a large extent. I mean, AIG has been going through a lot of changes really since the financial crisis, and because of that, people are actually anxious. Because of them being anxious, they have a strong sense that they want to be developed. So for them, they have a strong desire to want to get opportunities for learning and development. Meanwhile, the organization, because of its challenges, was almost going the opposite way. My learning and development budget was actually cut by 70%, and so people were really anxious that they weren't potentially getting all the offerings that they really wanted. But I'm sure that's being addressed now.
In the learning and development industry, particularly chief learning officers, is they aren't able to articulate the value proposition of the learning and development function well. Tell us how leaders can do this.
The most critical thing is who actually describes that value, and it's not the head of learning. The value proposition really needs to be stated by the business leaders themselves. The trick is how you have that conversation with them. Most leaders, you eventually you have a conversation with them. They're very quickly tell you what their need is, but often the initial discussion isn't really the right answer. You have to stay in that conversation to keep asking why and drill deeper and deeper. And it's actually challenging to do because most of the leaders get frustrated by it. They just want to place the order and leave, and you have to stay in that conversation long enough to find out what their need really is.
And tell us more about your role as head of people intelligence at BNY Mellon.
That was one of the rare instances where I didn't really select that role, it was assigned to me. And to tell you the truth, I didn't even like the job title when I first heard it, but it grew on me with time. That role really had two major accountabilities. One was to build a human capital analytics function. The second was to review, integrate, and improve our talent management processes. On building the analytics function, that really leveraged some work I'd done early with Pfizer, took it to a whole nother level. It was actually pretty fantastic. I mean, it was really interesting once we had the data and we analyzed it, what we learned about the organization. You know, for example, we had about 10,000 people leaders, but of those 10,000 people leaders, we had over 4,000 of them that were only managing 2 or 3 people. And so how do we reorganize the organization and make it far more effective? It was really a pretty exciting team. It was fun to do.
So tell us a little bit about what role analytics plays in learning and development organizations today.
I think there's the question of what role it plays and what role it can play. I think right now in many organizations, they finally are doing some analytics. They're actually measuring what learning is taking place and so forth. The trick, though, is that a lot of analytics is not really analytics, it's really reporting. So people are producing massive spreadsheets or different types of scorecards and so forth. What's lacking, I think, is the true intelligence, is actually analyzing what the information really needs. And I think that's one of the big opportunities for us.
What kind of role do you think artificial intelligence and machine learning have or will have in learning and development?
I think are going to be huge implications and offerings here. I think in particular for artificial intelligence, there's an opportunity for us to get much smarter in regards to how we direct the right learning assets to every given individual. So by having an AI program sort of crawl through your emails, look at your calendar, understand what's occurring in your life, actually deliver you what you need when you need it. In regards to machine learning, I think as we bring all this information together and actually have more of a big data sort of approach, we'll finally be able to understand what actually is it that our most high-performing people really do. What learning assets did they go into? Who did they communicate to? How many hours did they spend at work? How many times did they do various activities? And by that, I think we'll have a much more effective way of knowing which of our talent management processes are actually giving us the most value.
So what would you say are some of the biggest gaps or the skill gaps in the industry that's not allowing us to do some of these things yet?
One, I think a lot of people speak about the hype of the big data or artificial intelligence, but are they actually investing the right time to investigate it properly to really know what is the potential, what can be done? And I think that has to be done much more effectively than it currently is. The second is I believe that we have a skill gap issue. If you look at the HR function, we don't necessarily have all the skills we need within that function to be able to understand and then to implement what we're learning through these new technologies.
What would you say are some of the biggest challenges that learning leaders and chief learning officers are facing in organizations today?
One, of course, is the pace of change. You know, the phrase that the rate of change will never be as slow as it is today. And the fact that that's causing us to act in a much more agile way, which really means that even when you have things which are successfully being done, they're giving you impact, you can't stick with them too long because chances are it's going to be antiquated and it's going to have to be replaced with something else. And so dealing with that change process is huge. Another big challenge that we have as learning leaders is how we actually figure out different ways to collaborate and interact with each other. It used to be that you could operate in a bit of a silo, just have your learning. You now need to collaborate to integrate across all sorts of dimensions and therefore have to rebuild partnerships in many different ways across many different axes.
What would you say are some key components that are often lacking in an organization's talent management strategy?
One, in many cases, there is no strategy. And so do people actually write it down, codify it, actually have a true strategy? The other is if they do have a strategy, is it actually covering all the dimensions that need to be included? There's different models you could use. I happen to like the Deloitte 4Es model, where you look at education, exposure, environment, and aspects of experience. of all of those, I think the most challenging is environment. Again, going back to learning culture. Are we truly building a learning culture? But I think most of the strategies aren't comprehensive enough to make sure all the dimensions are covered.
For organizations that either don't have a talent management strategy or are lacking some components of it, how do you think that impacts employee morale, and how does it impact an organization's performance?
Well, one, I think employees increasingly understand that the learning curve is the new earning curve, as Josh Bersin has said, and therefore they have more stronger desires and needs for development than they ever had before. If those needs are not being met, they'll go somewhere else where they can be met. So I think there are big issues both on engagement and retention of staff, and therefore we have to up our game and do that much more powerfully than we've done in the past.
And then what about on organizational performance? What kind of impacts will there be?
Again, I think the world is becoming much more agile. I mean, you look at organizations, what's the biggest asset they have, where they spend most of their money on? It's their people, it's that intellectual property. If we don't actually invest in the development of our staff and be much more effective at doing that, then we will erode our performance. If you erode your performance, then somebody's going to take you out.
What are some of the biggest challenges you faced in creating and integrating a talent management system and strategies in a global organization?
Well, one is just finding all the pieces and just trying to make sure you can start putting it together. In most organizations, if you step back and look at the various talent management processes, it's akin to looking at a bowl of spaghetti. There's just nothing connected, it's all intertwined. So it takes a fair degree of discipline to look into each of those processes to try to connect them as best you can. And then once they are connected, to start extracting the data, and with that data, understanding what your needs are, and then developing the strategy.
And in terms of barriers, what kind of barriers did you face, obstacles, when you were putting together this talent management system?
I think one of the barriers that you run into is just, again, knowing what you don't know. And so to what degree, if you try to integrate everything, you can discover what's there. In many organizations, there are parallel processes, parallel systems that you just have to go in and discover, because you can't bring together and integrate things you don't know about. But not everybody wants to show and share with you what you have. They have to trust you. So you have to go out and build those relationships, show that you're there to help as opposed to control. And by building those relationships, collect your information and then start the integration process.
Would you say that that's how you overcame some of those challenges? Was that the biggest thing, would you say?
Yeah,
building trust?
I think the biggest way that you overcome most challenges is to get help. And the best way that you get help is to build trust. And therefore you have to invest the time to build those relationships.
Now, what would you say are some of the most effective ways of building a learning culture that ties back to your talent management strategy?
One, I think one of the big challenges you have and we have to do is we have to prioritize. We just can't do everything, and so you have to look at your organization, understand what those needs are, and prioritize those needs. You can't prioritize if you actually don't have collaboration, because without collaboration you can't agree on those priorities and you can't come into alignment. So a lot of it is that collective ownership, the collective conversation by which you then identify the most critical needs, and then you have the fortitude to commit to them and to stick with it to make sure that you make that progress.
Now, you also worked in diversity and inclusion for several years at firms like BP and Pfizer, Memorial Sloan Kettering. Tell us why it's important to have diversity and inclusion strategies and policies as part of an organization's overall strategy.
Well, I would say just look at the news, right? I mean, I think the world needs diversity and inclusion addressed now more than it ever has before. Why? Because the world is getting smaller. As the world is getting smaller, people with all sorts of different experiences and characteristics are now more frequently coming into contact with each other. What we need to understand is how, as we put people with these differences interacting with each other, how we respect those differences and leverage it to get to a higher outcome. So very often we talk about diversity inclusion strategy, there are three pillars of work: diversity, inclusion, and meritocracy. We need to understand the differences that exist and how to leverage them. On inclusion, we need to have the right behaviors that actually values and respects those differences. And finally, we need to have meritocracy to make sure there's no either intended or unintended biases in any of our management processes.
Can you tell us about the challenges that you faced in implementing some diversity and inclusion strategies while you were at the helm?
One, if you're not careful, you can become overly politically correct. You know, I was with one organization where early on I asked them about the diversity of their high potential list. And they said, oh, it's very diverse. So I got the list, and by looking at the list, I realized the vast majority was white males. And so when I challenged them on this, they said, well, what do you mean? At our organization, everyone's diverse. And so, I believe that we need to look at things like diversity of thought. I believe we need to look at all sorts of aspects. But you can't get to the place where you ignore the fact that there are still basic systemic issues dealing with gender, ethnicity, and other dimensions that have to be addressed. So don't become overly politically correct. You have to address those real issues.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the most pertinent diversity and inclusion strategies that organizations should be thinking about and why it's important that they do?
I believe if we're going to address diversity and inclusion seriously, then we need to treat it like any other business opportunity or challenge. So that, to a large extent, to me, means measurement, metrics, and then setting clear goals and objectives that have bite to them. A lot of organizations will say, yes, our objective is to increase diversity or increase inclusion. No, tell me specifically how much. And if you're not willing to actually set those clear, precise metrics, then I don't believe the rate of change will ever occur rapidly enough for you.
What have you seen are some of the ramifications of businesses that don't have effective diversity and inclusion strategies as part of their overall organizational strategy?
And there are probably four things that come to mind for me. One is that they lose key talent. People just leave the organization. Two, they don't have the ability to go out and acquire key talent. Third is I actually think because you can't get that key talent, there's actually an erosion of performance for the organization. And finally, I think there's actually a lessening of engagement. And I've seen that occur in more than one organization.
One key role for you was removing unintended biases in the talent management process. Explain what this means.
Yeah, that really links back to that meritocracy, where you actually have to look at your various talent management processes and actually review them to ensure that they're operating without any bias, be it intentional or unintentional. I also believe that when we think about this aspect of bias, it's hard because we have to understand that as human beings, we sort of naturally want to recreate ourselves in our own image. The sociologists call this homosocial reproduction, that any organization will just recreate itself in its own light unless you intervene. So you have to consciously fight against that. You have to constantly build skills. Just because people are aware that they have unconscious biases doesn't make them go away. You have to invest in the development of skills so that those behavior changes can occur.
Can you describe what an unintended bias is?
Usually an unintended bias is where you actually don't understand the frame that you're using as you look at a given situation or a given person. You automatically start making assumptions that have been programmed into you by your own life experiences, in some cases just the environment that you're in. And very often people are ignorant of the fact of even knowing that those stereotypes, those biases are there. So you need to identify them, and once you identify them, you need to consciously intervene and to fight against them.
What ways did you do that?
Very often it was by opening up the conversation for people to start exploring what was actually triggering their biases, and then for people to talk about the implications occurring to others when those biases actually were put into place. And a big part also is getting people to understand the importance of metrics and measures and how that you just can't trust your superficial judgment. You actually have to look at the data as well to make sure that you understand whether things are being impacted both by conscious and unconscious bias.
Now, an important digital learning strategy is also important to organizations today. Tell us how you implemented a digital learning strategy in some of the organizations that you worked with.
Well, when I think about AIG, one of the first things we did was really increase and expand the modalities of our learning offerings. When I got there, virtually everything was very sort of simplistic face-to-face training programs. We really had to reinvent all that. The thing, though, that really made it possible was partnering with our IT organization. I'm amazed at the number of learning organizations that are saying that they're doing more work in digital. And I asked them, great, how are you partnering with IT? And they hardly mention it at all. So forming that partnership, in particular at AIG, we were able to actually together increase that level of skill in the organization and actually develop some pretty amazing technologies, solutions internally, and then launch them out for our organization.
Can you describe what some of those were?
One of them was this thing called leadership expeditions. And that, we had 10,000 leaders across AIG. And the way we were nominally training them was these traditional face-to-face programs, which meant that every tranche of leadership was getting a different experience. And because we had 10,000 leaders, it would take decades to address them all. And so what we did is we partnered with IT and we came up with a whole series of micro-learnings. And by having all these micro-learning and other assets, we, for the first time, were able to actually touch all of our 10,000 people leaders all at the same time to start building that common set of skills.
And what was the response like?
One response you could judge is just, well, do people like it or not? And so if you look at the feedback, it was varied, but a lot of people really enjoyed it. They loved the fact that it was mobily enabled and they could learn anywhere and so forth. That was great. But there are aspects that they miss because people still like to go to those face-to-face programs. So we had to figure out different ways to address those needs and still make it a very blended learning process.
Explain the concept of micro-learning and how that's gained importance in the corporate world.
Well, first we have to define what micro-learning is, right? And at least in my terminology, we sort of understand that based on neuroscience, the average adult attention span is 11 minutes. So micro-learning is really how do you take your learning content and chunk it into sizes that you can deliver it within that time frame. So I think that's really good and it's fantastic we're doing it. Unfortunately though, there's another critical component which isn't always being done, and that's what I would call micro-testing. Because we know from neuroscience that after someone learns, goes through this experience of getting new knowledge, the most important thing you need to do is to validate that by testing them. And so what we've been putting in place is a series of micro-learning and micro-assessments that by then following a certain trajectory, build that common set of skills that we need to build across the organization.
Tell us about how you measure the success of your learning programs.
Actually, not very well. I think the challenge of measuring the value in the byproduct of learning is actually quite challenging. Sure, there are some cases which are fairly straightforward. So for example, very often when you launch new sales programs, you do correlations between, well, who's attended these programs and what's their revenue generation and can you correlate it? A lot of work has been done on this ROI calculation work, which I think could be useful, but also can lead to a lot of artificial inaccuracy and I think can be a waste of time. I do believe, though, with the use of adaptive learning technologies, we're going to be able to do a much better job of not only reinforcing that learning by testing people after they get learned, by doing that over time to see if the stickiness of learning has actually been there. So that's one of the things that we've been putting in place with the adaptive learning to be able to do a better job at measuring that impact.
Tell us how you've seen analytics and analytics tools being used successfully in learning and development.
One way I think we've been using analytics effectively is to really understand how is it people learn. Because now with these various learning platforms, the ability to track individuals, we can actually see what people are actually doing. So do people go in and dip in and out and get little snippets of knowledge? Do they go in there and spend 3 hours? Do they gorge it and spend a Friday afternoon? But we're finally getting the sense of how people are utilizing these assets and then determining what impact they're having and then having different strategies of trying to guide the organization and being more effective how we deliver it.
Now, many chief learning officers are also talking about some of the challenges of effectively engaging the next generation workforce. Talk about what some of these challenges are that you faced.
To be honest, in many cases, for example, we talked about the millennials. And believe me, there are some differences from that generation in regards to how they've grown up and the technologies they've been exposed to. They've been certainly raised by the internet and smartphones, et cetera. That being said, I think there's a lot of hype there. And so to some degree, I look at the millennial topic almost like the Y2K issue, where it was overly amplified, I think, for the benefit of various consultants and authors. So we have to be careful. There are differences, but let's not overly exaggerate those differences. But because the emerging workforce has been exposed to technology, they have an expectation of that quality of what that experience is like. If we don't offer internally to our employees the same quality of experience, then they're going to be very dissatisfied. And I think they do have a different attitude towards how they want access to information. So I don't think we should be restricting access because that will be a challenge. And we should expect that what they do know, they're going to share, which we should encourage. But if we try to limit that sharing, I don't think that would be very effective either.
How do organizations handle that balance of allowing employees to be able to access certain sites or certain information with the challenge of possibly having them share the wrong information or too much information or something sensitive?
There's a mixture of things. So one, clearly there are concerns with IT security and so forth, and we do have to have some safeguards and some controls. That being said, we have to minimize restrictions on access to information. Increasingly, people are finding that there's so much information available in the world, we need to help people to get access to that. But we have to explain to people what is their accountability in regards to what they can and cannot do with the information, particular information that's unique to our given organization, and what are the boundaries around that. And very often we assume that people know that, but I'm not convinced that we properly instruct them. So I think it has to be a mature conversation, but one with realistic expectations.
What would you say are some advantages and disadvantages of digital learning?
I think the advantages, one is just scalability, that you can actually touch large amounts of people all at the same time. And the other is the mobile enablement, that people can actually get access to learning on multiple platforms, 24 hours, 7 days a week, whatever they want. That's fantastic. The disadvantages are, though, that for a lot of people, and we've been told this, it's lonely. They actually like learning to be a social experience and want that interconnections with people. So we have to figure out how we mix those modalities together and don't have everything just be sort of on these platforms and so forth. I think the bigger concern I have in regards to a challenge is people becoming overwhelmed. If you look at the amount of learning content that exists in the world today, 80% has been generated in the past 2 years, and that rate just keeps on climbing. And the good old internet, we keep on putting it there, but almost nothing leaves. So increasingly, as we have this explosion of learning content, how do we enable people to be able to sift through it and actually find what's most useful for them?
So what's the role of the L&D function and helping employees sift through all of that?
One is, I think we need to, there in that case, I think is where we can use some new technologies. I believe the artificial intelligence is a great vehicle by which the more we can understand the characteristics of our people, how do we allow that, hence that when they go searching for things, it actually delivers for them the information that's most pertinent to them.
And do you think that we're getting to a point where artificial intelligence will be able to do that?
Yes, I do. I think it's emerging. You know, I think artificial intelligence is probably in the HR function mainly right now. It's on the bottification of HR, the generation of certain algorithms that can scan resumes or do salary profiles and things like that. I think in the learning space it's only now just emerging, but I'm very hopeful that we're going to make some rapid progress in that dimension.
So what are some of the digital strategies that you've implemented that you found most effective?
Well, again, I think one has been this use of multiple modalities of content. I think all of us have to understand that for any given bit of knowledge, we fall somewhere on this spectrum between being a novice, a practitioner, or an expert. That means that whatever knowledge we have, whatever learning material we have, has to exist in these multiple formats. Hence that depending on the unique needs of that learner, they get what's most relevant for them. The other way of doing that is the greater utilization of adaptive learning technologies. Hence that if you and I go to the same learning program, we have a complete, unique, different experience because that learning program is adapting to what we each know and altering that experience and optimize the level of difficulty, hence that it actually maximizes that learning process.
Tell us how leaders can actually build a culture of learning that weaves into the fabric of the organization.
I think for leaders, there's probably three major things that they need to do. One is they need to be lifelong learners themselves, so they need to be committed to that, and that needs to be visible to their organizations. Second is they need to build a culture that allows time for reflection. Again, if there's no reflection, there's really no learning, so they have to build and value that time. And finally, as leaders, they need to be individuals that generate a culture that allows for failure. Because if we don't have space for failure, we also won't have space for learning.
What do you think are some of the skills that C-suite leaders need in order to navigate some of the big shifts that are occurring today?
I think one, they have to be comfortable and be skilled at living in an agile world. So they need to be far more flexible. And because of that flexibility, they need to be far more collaborative because increasingly they need to build partnerships on multiple dimensions. And they also need to be more humble because they need to understand that they don't know all the answers and they need to generate an environment that people are willing to share with them their view of what the potential answers could be.
Do you find that leaders are open to this type of change in the way they need to behave to navigate some of these shifts?
I think it varies. You know, unfortunately, a lot of leaders I know are not the most collaborative of individuals. They've got to where they are by being a bit less collaborative and have learned that behavior. Unfortunately, that is becoming increasingly a risk that if they continue to operate that way, they will no longer be able to perform, hence the organizations they lead will not perform.
What skills do you see are most lacking in leaders today?
Again, I think our leaders need to understand the value of learning. in particular for themselves. So they need to be lifelong learners. They need to develop those skills. They also need to start building partnerships with different entities that a year ago they didn't even know existed. And they need to spend the time on building those partnerships. And they need to listen far more effectively than them before, because the organization, if you're going to be in an agile situation, you have to be really listening closely for what the organization is telling you in regards to what's working and what's not.
What kind of management leadership training is required in today's digital reality?
I think in the digital reality, we have, a need for people to be far more digital savvy. And so even though we're all utilizing technology, are we really skilled at using it as effectively as we need to? So I think we need to expose people and help educate people about what technology is available, to get them comfortable with it, and to keep on putting that into practice, hence that they can actually take advantage of these new tools that we're giving to them.
Tell us about some of the skill gaps that you are seeing that you think are going to impact how business is done in the future.
Well, one, again, if you look at the change of business, one thing we know is that the rate of disruption is continually increasing. And so that requires us to really have an agile workforce, and that requires us to have an agile culture. That is quite challenging for a lot of leaders. It really means that you cannot be overly invested in what you're doing today, because chances are what you do tomorrow is going to have to be different. And that's going to require a much different mindset and the ability not to fall in love with your own solutions, because chances are they're not going to last that long.
Well, this was great, Dan. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure.
And we'll see you next time on Starter TV.